Welcome, students, to week 8. We've looked at a broad framework for transformational development and Christian community development, and then we've narrowed down some and we've looked at strategies, particularly strategies that are unique to the various Christian forms of development. Now we're going to do a step more focused, and we're going to actually talk about the how. How do you do transformational development and Christian community development? And what's interesting is that there is some different language that each discipline uses, but the language refers to the same realities. So we're going to be looking at the actual methods, what you might call the practices, and then we're going to be looking at the guiding principles that shape the way that you carry out those methods. And we're also going to end up looking at what it requires from a practitioner in order to carry out those principles and practices, what kind of practitioners you need and how they need to be formed and supported. So let's talk about designing a program. First of all, you need a plan. If you don't know where you're going and how you're planning to get there, you're not going to arrive. Pretty simple. So the basic components of a plan, a development plan, are assessment. You have to understand what are the problems or needs in the community. You have to understand what are the assets and resources of that community or that are in that community. Then you need a design. And in transformational development, we use words like purpose, outcomes, inputs and outputs, and activities. In community development, we talk about goals, objectives, resources, strategies, and methods. Just slightly different terminology for referring to the same basic activities. The design looks at external plans. How are you going to concretely change the common life of the community? But also, how are you impacting the individuals and the families and the members of the community in the process? So here is where we would look at questions of identity, vocation, building a just and peaceful community. And of course, we also want to look at the spiritual well-being of the community, and all of that needs to be part of the design. Then there's the implementation of the design, the monitoring, or in community development, we would call documentation, what's actually going on, and then the evaluation, the reflection on what you've learned from what has been going on. So you've got to do that process. That's a plan. But how you create and implement a plan is every bit as important as the plan itself. You can have the best plan in the world, and if you don't do it in the right way, it plain and simple won't work. So what is the process that you need to follow for effective development? First of all, you're not doing a plan that you're just steaming ahead with and implementing regardless. You need a reflection-action cycle. And you need a reflection-action cycle both to ensure that you're continually course-correcting, that you're learning and improving the plan as you go, but also so that you are building the capacity of the people in the process. So that every time that they reflect on what they've been doing, they learn and they grow and their skill level raises. You always start small in terms of your action. And it's an experiment. You evaluate the experiment, you envision, and the action gets broader and more effective. You also want to have a continually expanding circle of leaders. So you might start with a few leaders, but you keep bringing leaders into the process as you go. And of course, you want that to be as inclusive as possible because you want the whole community in support of the program. The more people in support of it, the more likely that program is to sustain, the more likely it is to be effective, and also because you want to take advantage of all the gifts of everyone in the community. And you need to be particularly conscious of who is not being included. And so that, of course, is often women and children. So you need to say, how can children be an active part? How can children be leaders? How can children be an active part of the development process? Then, of course, you're involving the leaders in every aspect of the plan. So the leaders are involved in the assessment. And there are a couple of tools for assessment. Appreciative inquiry is a tool, AI, that is talked about in development, in transformational development. It's talked about a little less in Christian community development, although it is to some extent. And then ABCD, asset-based community development, uses very similar techniques to appreciative inquiry, and sometimes it even uses appreciative inquiry. But essentially what you're doing, of course, when you're doing this assessment is making sure that you really pay attention to the assets, not just the needs. And you also ask people not just what they already are and have, but what their dreams are. And you look for innovators as you're doing the process. You look for what is called in the literature positive deviance. Who is an early adopter? Who is already doing something that the rest of the community needs to get on board with? Now, as you're doing the assessment, you also want to pay attention to the whole history and story. Ineffective development is often ahistorical. That someone comes in to change a community not conscious of what has already been attempted, what has failed, and what has succeeded. You really need to understand the history to know how the Holy Spirit has already been at work in that community and how you can take it to the next level. You also need to, of course, understand all the beliefs and values of that community, its capacities and its vulnerabilities. Then, as you go through this reflection action process, you have to be very intentional about concientización, which is a process developed by Paulo Freire and used universally. And it's the process of an increasing awareness of the impact of the structures and systems around you on how you see the world, on your culture, and on your capacity. So as you go through the process, you start by saying the problem is hungry children. And then on the next level, you say, why are the children hungry? Is there a more effective way of responding to their hunger than just giving them food? So your understanding of the program and of the problem and of the scope of the problem, how all the different forces and players around you feed into this problem, your understanding of the problem, the scope of the problem, and the potential responses to the problem grow as you go. And therefore, the project gets broader and more effective. So in Bryant Meyer's book, he talks about ARVIN, which is a system for advocacy, that when you begin to actually take on the systems and structures around you. I wanted to just, then the other guiding principle is knowledge sharing, that people who are experts are bringing knowledge, and people who are in the community have knowledge. They have indigenous knowledge. So what you're looking at is how that knowledge gets combined and integrated in a way that the people have ownership of. So I wanted to share a story from the Barefoot Doctors in the Philippines, that they were dealing with issues around sanitation, that they really wanted to encourage people to build latrines. And a number of the community elders were very suspicious of that process. They said, you're telling us that bacteria cause diseases in children. It's not bacteria, it's demons. So what the Barefoot Doctors did was they brought in a microscope and they said to the elders, this is a machine that helps you to see where the demons are present. That you look in this machine and you can see this is what the demons look like. Well, and of course they were talking about bacteria. And it turned out that the elders were extremely effective at identifying bad bacteria. They were really good at it. They'd spent a lot of time in discernment. So they used the microscopes. They realized that these little things were a form of evil, and they did what was necessary to build latrines. So that was a knowledge sharing. Then you really need to make sure that if you want the community to own the program, and it will not sustain and it will not be effective to the degree that it is not owned, you've got to build in ongoing shared decision making and responsibility. And then lastly, you need to do holistic evaluation. That if you really want to meet all these objectives, the more internal ones, the spiritual ones, and the more external ones, you've got to have evaluation that takes all of that into account, all the goals, and also the process evaluation. And there is a grid for holistic evaluation on pages 300 and 301 in the book that's very useful. So I'm going to give you a little case study so this takes flesh. So a number of years ago, I was working with a community of migrant farm workers in Watsonville, California. It was 1979. The problem that we were dealing with was that the typical life of migrant farm workers in the United States is that they would follow the crops. So they would work in one area for a while. They would work in Watsonville during the spring and summer. And then during the winter, they would go to other parts of the country where there were other crops. But part of what happened as a result was a generational cycle of poverty, because they would pull the children out of school as they went to each place. And sometimes they weren't in a place long enough to even enroll the children in school. So the children missed a lot of school. They never completed their education, and they just became farm workers. So they had made a decision, some of these farm workers, that they would not travel, that they would stay, that the men would leave, and the men would go far afield looking for some kind of work. They wouldn't have as much work because they couldn't go as far, but they would find some work. But sometimes they didn't send the money home. They drank the money instead. And there wasn't as much money. So the women began to brainstorm how they could find an alternative source of money. So we worked with them, and we defined the need as an alternative source of income to enable children to study. We named our resources, that we had women caring for children who had time, and they had cooking skills. There was also a culture of hard work. A lot of the women were Christians and had deep faith. We also were connected to a network of supportive churches, so we saw that as a resource as well. The design, we decided that we would start a tortilla business. And in addition to making money, that the goals would be to empower and train women and to build a just and peaceful community that was both among the women and also between the women and the churches, because there were lots of people in the churches who didn't know anything about migrant farm workers and even had prejudice against them. So we really wanted to do that as well as part of our goals. And then under the monitoring and evaluation, we decided to do both external or hard fact monitoring and also self-reporting. And we used a participatory action research process for that. Then the process. We started with just a few leaders, really visionary women. But then they went out and did one-on-one meetings with all the other women. They did house meetings. They formed research teams, because remember, you want to involve them in all aspects, and they researched other small business projects that were working, and they researched tortilla making businesses. And then they brought that back, and when we had the plan, we had a big community meeting with as many of the men as we could involve to get their support. And then we formed a planning committee, including the innovators that we had met in the process of the one-on-ones. We took them through a series of trainings, because they needed skills training, and meetings with partners. Through the process, we also paid attention to the spiritual dynamics. We did Bible study and prayer, of course, and leadership development, and we taught them power sharing practices. We worked on healing and conflict resolution. Now, there's a list of scriptures in the back of Bryant Meyer's book that's very useful that you can use, that are particular scriptures that help with this kind of Bible study that is integrated with the development process. The initial activities were the fundraising and preparation, and then we did full implementation, and we used a reflection action cycle, continuing to develop their consciousness. So in order to do this, you have to have the right practitioners. So what does that mean? Who are the right practitioners? Well, you have to have serious disciples of Jesus Christ as core staff. You can have people that are not serious disciples of Jesus Christ as volunteers, as volunteer leaders, sometimes as other staff, but the core staff need to be serious disciples of Jesus Christ. Now, that's a criteria, but you also realize that that requires, in many cases, intentional formation by the organization and support processes. So you need practices that enable people to reflect on their work in the light of their faith, and also room for self-care. So you need a certain kind of character in people. Humility, 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 humility. It's the most important piece. Patience, openness to learn, loving, being a good neighbor, integrity. And your practitioners need to be faithful in their spiritual disciplines. They need to be prayerful, to discern the movement of the Spirit, to discern not just problems, not just discern the spirits, but opportunities for change, to act theologically, and to practice incarnational spirituality. They have to be active members of local churches, so they're not in competition with local churches. And they need to be artists as well as scientists, because it's not linear. This work is very fluid, and you need to be an artist as well as a scientist. Then I'm also having you read an article by Modasani, who is an Indigenous development leader. And she describes what she does to be an effective development leader. And I think it's just very useful for us to look at. It's another perspective, right? She talks first about sensitivity to culture, but not subservience. That she's very sensitive, for example, to the treatment of elders in the organization. She's also sensitive to the reality that women are not expected to lead in many ways in her context, but not subservient to that. that the gospel has the final word. So she's sensitive to culture, but not subservient. She describes herself as a sponge, just willing to learn in any way. So that's a form of humility, right? She intentionally facilitates dialogue at all levels of the organization, and she's proactive, unearthing problems while they're small. She focused on reworking the sharing of the workload in her organization so it was equitable and wise, paying attention to gifts, on having a culture of welcome to welcome newcomers so that the work continually expands, to lead with hope, to practice honesty, humility, fairness, and integrity, and to make room for happiness and spiritual fulfillment. So very interesting. The last thing I want to mention are some of the issues that you have to deal with in Christian development, faith-based development, whether it's transformational development or Christian community development. There's always a tension between donors and communities because donors have their agenda. They're giving their money for a purpose. And sometimes that's not the same agenda as the communities. So you really have to dance that dance as well as possible, which often has to do with pace. People often move more slowly than donors want them to do, and shortcuts don't work in the end. So you really do have to decide how many people is a critical mass. There are people you're not going to get on board immediately or not going to do the work very well. And so, how do you balance that, right? Then the definition of a community, which is obvious in a village, but is not obvious in an inner city. Like, what are the boundaries of the community that you're working with? I love this word that some of the Filipinos in World Vision used. They created, which is facipulation, where you appear to facilitate, but you're actually manipulating. People are very wise to that, actually, and you need to not do it. And then the whole challenge of setting appropriate limits. You have to let people make mistakes or they never learn. We know that as parents, but you don't have to support their mistakes. So if the people are making a decision that is really is in contradiction with our Christian values, you don't stop them, but you don't go along with them. So, it's also a dance. Then you always have to prepare to leave. That ultimately, every project has to be completely owned by the people. That means you have to replicate leaders, and in all the ways you work, you have to diminish dependency. So again, as always, I look forward to your posts this week. You're an amazing group of people. Thank you.